It was a warm afternoon in the bustling city of Brookhaven. FBI Special Agent Maya Ellis, a brilliant and highly accomplished black woman, was driving back to headquarters after wrapping up a grueling investigation. For months, she had been chasing down leads on a high-profile drug syndicate, inching closer to a critical breakthrough. Despite the exhaustion from long nights and constant pressure, Maya felt a deep sense of pride in her work. Being one of the few black women in an agency dominated by white men was no small feat. She had worked hard to earn her place and the respect of her colleagues. As she navigated the busy streets, her mind replayed the latest intelligence on the case, piecing together clues to determine her next move. Suddenly, flashing blue lights illuminated her rearview mirror. Startled, Maya glanced down at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Confused, she pulled over to the curb, her heart racing as she tried to figure out what had prompted the stop. A patrol car parked behind her, and a tall, stern-looking white officer stepped out, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. His name badge read, Officer Blake. He approached Maya's car with deliberate slowness, his expression unreadable. Maya rolled down her window, her calm demeanor intact, and reached for her FBI badge. As a seasoned professional, she was used to high-pressure situations. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" she asked politely. Blake barely acknowledged her greeting, his voice sharp and curt. "License and registration," he barked, ignoring her entirely. Taken aback by his hostile tone, Maya remained professional. "I'm an FBI agent. Here's my badge," she said, holding it out for him to see. Blake glanced briefly at the badge, his frown deepening. "I said license and registration," he repeated, his dismissive tone sending a chill down Maya's spine. Something wasn't right. Maya had dealt with difficult officers before, but Blake's attitude felt deliberate. His refusal to recognize her authority as a federal agent struck her as deeply unsettling. "Officer, I'm on official duty," she reiterated, her voice steady but firm. She was determined to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled further. Blake's expression darkened as he leaned closer. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered sharply. Maya froze in disbelief. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice edged with shock. "Are you deaf?" I said, "Step out of the vehicle." Blake's voice rose, drawing the attention of people nearby. Maya hesitated. She knew her rights. There was no valid reason for her to exit the car. The situation was escalating quickly, and the racial undertones were impossible to ignore. "Officer, I'm complying, but I want you to understand that I'm a federal agent," she said firmly, trying to remain calm. Blake's face twisted in disdain. "I don't care if you're the mayor. Get out, or I'll drag you out myself." Maya felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Slowly, she opened the car door, stepping out with her hands visible. Passers-by had begun to gather, whispering among themselves, but no one intervened. Before Maya could say another word, Blake grabbed her arm roughly and shoved her against the car. "Hey, what are you doing?" Maya protested, her voice filled with disbelief and anger. "Resisting arrest, huh?" Blake sneered, twisting her arm behind her back as he snapped handcuffs on her wrists. "You think you can flash a badge and do whatever you want?" Maya winced as the cuffs bit into her skin. Humiliation and outrage coursed through her. She had spent her career upholding the law, yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. Blake's blatant disregard for her status as a federal agent was both shocking and infuriating. Bystanders were recording the scene on their phones, their murmurs of disbelief filling the air. Maya's face burned with anger and embarrassment, but she refused to let this officer break her spirit. "Officer Blake, you're making a mistake," she said, her voice trembling slightly but steady with determination. "Shut your mouth," Blake snapped. "You think you're better than everyone else because you've got that badge? Well, you're not above the law." Maya's mind raced. She had to stay calm, but she also needed to figure out how to get out of this mess without escalating it further. Her colleagues at the FBI would be shocked if they knew she had been arrested without cause while on duty. Blake dragged her toward his patrol car, ignoring her attempts to reason with him. As he shoved her into the back seat, Maya caught glimpses of the crowd filming the incident. Their shocked faces mirrored her own disbelief, but none of them stepped in to challenge the officer. Maya took a deep breath, trying to center herself. She had faced danger before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about her job. It was personal. And she knew this was only the beginning. Blake had crossed a line, and Maya Ellis knew she couldn't let him get away with it. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out her next move. Would she call for backup? Would she file a formal complaint? She couldn't afford to lose her temper, not now, but she also couldn't let this injustice go unanswered. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Maya's thoughts were spinning. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Sitting in the back of the patrol car, her wrists throbbed from the tight cuffs, the cold metal digging into her skin. Maya stared out the window as the city streets blurred past, her mind working overtime. This wasn't just a routine arrest. There was something personal behind it. Officer Blake had a vendetta, and it was squarely aimed at her. Was it because she was a black woman? Or was it simply because he wanted to assert his authority over her without consequence? Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered now was how she would handle this. As they drove, Maya fought to stay composed. Her training had prepared her for high-stress situations, but this one felt different. Every ounce of her self-control was needed to keep her emotions in check. She instinctively thought of calling her supervisor, but her phone was out of reach, and her hands were cuffed tightly behind her back. She briefly considered asking Blake to loosen the cuffs, but the smug look he had flashed earlier told her it would be pointless. Blake glanced at her through the rearview mirror, a smirk playing on his lips. "So, you thought you could get away with pretending to be FBI, huh?" His voice was dripping with arrogance. Maya's eyes narrowed. "I'm not pretending. I am a federal agent, and you're making a huge mistake." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Sure you are, and I'm the governor," he said, his mocking tone igniting the anger simmering inside her. Maya bit her tongue, refusing to engage further. She knew reasoning with him was a waste of time. The car eventually pulled up in front of a small, dilapidated police station on the outskirts of Brookhaven. Maya's stomach sank. This wasn't the central precinct she was familiar with. This station looked older, rarely used, a deliberate choice, she realized. Blake had brought her somewhere out of the way, likely to avoid oversight from his superiors or anyone else who might challenge his actions. Blake got out of the car, opened the back door, and yanked her out roughly by the arm. "Let's go, Agent," he sneered, putting sarcastic emphasis on the word. Maya winced as he shoved her toward the entrance. She kept her composure, though the humiliation and anger boiled inside her. She had been through intense training and dangerous field operations, but nothing had prepared her for this kind of blatant disrespect. It wasn't just about being arrested. It was about being seen as less than human because of her gender, her race, and her position. The station was eerily quiet. A few officers lingered near the front desk, but none of them so much as looked up as Blake led her through. Their indifference was chilling. It was clear this kind of behavior from Blake was expected, even accepted. Maya realized with a sinking feeling that no one here would step in to help her. She was completely on her own. Blake pushed her into a small, dimly lit interrogation room and slammed the door shut behind them. Inside, there was only a metal table and 2 chairs. He shoved her into one of the chairs, leaving the cuffs on. "Let me get one thing straight," Blake began, pacing back and forth. "I don't care who you say you are. To me, you're just another criminal trying to pull a fast one." Maya glared at him, refusing to be intimidated. "You're violating my rights. You have no reason to hold me, and when this is over, you'll regret it." Blake stopped pacing and leaned in close, his face inches from hers. "Is that a threat, Agent?" His voice was low and menacing. Maya didn't flinch. "It's a promise." Blake stared at her for a long moment, then laughed bitterly. "You really think you're untouchable, don't you? Flashing that badge like it means something. Well, let me tell you something. You're in my territory now." Maya could feel the tension in the air, but she held his gaze steadily. "I've dealt with bigger threats than you, Officer Blake. You won't get away with this." Blake straightened, his smirk returning. "We'll see about that." He muttered before storming out of the room, leaving her alone. As the door slammed shut behind him, Maya exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She needed to contact her team, but she had no allies in this station. Blake would do everything in his power to keep her isolated. She scanned the room for anything that could help. There was a small window near the ceiling, but it was too high to reach. The door was locked from the outside, and her hands were still cuffed. Despite the odds, Maya's determination only grew. She wasn't about to let Blake win. She needed to find a way to turn the situation in her favor, and fast. Locked from the outside, the interrogation room offered Maya Ellis little in the way of options. Her only asset was her badge, still tucked in her jacket pocket, but with her hands cuffed behind her back, it was impossible to reach. Minutes dragged by, and frustration gnawed at her. She wasn't accustomed to this kind of vulnerability. Maya was always the one in control, the one issuing orders, not sitting powerless under the control of someone else. The dynamics in this room felt wrong on every level. She needed to regain the upper hand, and fast. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and a different officer entered. This man was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, and his nervous expression set him apart from Blake's domineering demeanor. He hesitated before speaking, clutching a file in his hand. "Agent Ellis," he began cautiously, glancing between her and the file. "I'm Officer Reed. I've been instructed to process you for holding. Look, I'm sorry about all of this." Maya's eyebrows lifted in surprise. His tone lacked the hostility she had come to expect from Blake. Maybe, just maybe, this man could be an ally. Before she could respond, the door swung open again, and Blake stormed in, his face dark with irritation. "What's taking so long?" Blake snapped, his gaze locking onto Reed with contempt. "She's a detainee, not a crossword puzzle." Reed flinched slightly but nodded. "Yes, sir," he stammered, his unease clear. Blake lingered, his eyes narrowing as he glanced between Maya and Reed, his suspicion palpable. After a tense moment, he turned and left the room, muttering under his breath. Maya's gaze met Reed's. There was something about his nervous mannerisms and unease that suggested he wasn't fully on board with Blake's actions. She decided to test the waters. "Reed," she said softly, her tone measured. "I don't know what's happening here, but you do, don't you?" Reed swallowed hard, avoiding her eyes as he pulled out a small notebook. "I just need some basic information," he said, his voice shaky. "Name, date of birth, that kind of thing." "You already know who I am," Maya replied, her voice calm but firm. "And you know this isn't right." Reed's pen froze mid-scribble, and for a brief moment his eyes met hers. She saw a flicker of guilt there, but it was quickly masked by an attempt at professionalism. "I don't make the rules," he muttered under his breath, looking down at his notepad. Maya leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a steady whisper. "You may not make the rules, but you're choosing to follow orders you know are wrong." Reed hesitated, the pen trembling in his hand. The tension in the room was thick, and it was clear that he was struggling with his conscience. Maya pressed on, her tone softening. "I can help you, but I need you to help me first." Reed looked around nervously, as though expecting Blake to barge back in at any moment. His shoulders sagged under the weight of the situation. "This isn't how it's supposed to go," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. "I know something's off, but Blake, he's the senior officer. I can't just—" "Blake is abusing his power," Maya interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. "You see it, you know it, and if you don't do something about it now, you're just as responsible as he is." Reed shifted uncomfortably, her words clearly hitting a nerve. He opened his mouth to respond but froze as the door slammed open again. Blake stormed back in, his expression hard and unforgiving. "What's the holdup, Reed?" he barked. "She's not a math problem. Get her processed and into holding, now." Reed jumped up from his chair, fumbling to shove his notebook back into his pocket. "I was just getting the information, sir," he stammered. Blake sneered, clearly unimpressed. "Move it. We don't have all day." Reed avoided Maya's gaze as he motioned for her to follow him, his discomfort evident. But Maya wasn't done. Not yet. "You're making a mistake, Officer Blake," she said, her voice steady and authoritative. "This is going to come back on you. I guarantee it." Blake stopped and turned to her, laughing harshly. The sound echoed through the small room. "Oh, I'm sure you think so, sweetheart. But around here, no one cares about your so-called authority. You think flashing that FBI badge makes you untouchable? Think again." Maya held his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not here to impress you, Blake. I'm here to do my job, and trust me, the people who do care will be coming for you." For a brief moment, something flickered in Blake's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by his usual smug arrogance. "We'll see about that," he muttered, turning on his heel and walking away. Maya glanced back at Reed as he led her out of the room. She couldn't ignore the conflict she'd seen in his expression. He might not be ready to act now, but she knew one thing: he could be the key to turning the tide. Officer Reed's hand trembled slightly as he grabbed Maya Ellis by the arm, leading her down the narrow hallway toward a holding cell. The tension between them was impossible to ignore. Maya could sense that Reed was struggling with what had just happened in the interrogation room. Still, he remained silent as they walked. At the end of the hallway, Reed unlocked the cell door and motioned for her to step inside. Maya paused, turning to look at him directly. "You still have a choice," she said quietly, her voice firm yet calm. "You don't have to go along with this." Reed avoided her gaze, his shoulders slumping. He muttered something under his breath, too soft for her to catch, then shut the cell door behind her without another word. Inside the cold small cell, Maya sat down on the metal bench and exhaled deeply. The walls felt as though they were closing in on her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help her now. As the hours dragged on, she found herself consumed by frustration and anger. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom, she was fighting against the blatant injustice that had put her here. The racism, the abuse of power, the humiliation, it all burned in her chest, fueling her resolve to see this through. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Maya tensed, her breath catching. Was it Blake coming back to gloat or escalate things further? To her surprise, it was Reed who appeared at the door to her cell. He glanced around nervously, his eyes darting to make sure no one was watching. Then, with shaking hands, he unlocked the cell door and pushed it open. "What are you doing?" Maya whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. Reed looked over his shoulder, his face pale with anxiety. "I'm getting you out of here," he replied in a hushed tone. "But we don't have much time." Maya hesitated. She wanted to trust him, but after everything that had happened, how could she? Still, she had no better options. If there was even a slim chance Reed was genuine, she had to take it. Without another word, she followed him out of the cell and into the dimly lit hallway. They moved quickly, avoiding the main corridors of the station. Maya's heart pounded as they crept through the shadows, every sound making her fear they'd been caught. Finally, they reached the back exit. Reed paused, pulling a set of keys from his pocket and unlocking the door. He held it open, the cool night air spilling in through the gap. "This is your chance," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Get out of here before Blake figures out what's going on." Maya froze for a moment, standing just outside the threshold. Could she trust him? This entire ordeal had been a nightmare, and trusting anyone in this station felt like a gamble. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Reed hesitated, looking as though he might change his mind. Finally, he sighed and muttered, "Because it's wrong. What Blake is doing, it's not just wrong, it's illegal. He's going to pay for it one way or another. But if you stay here, you're the one who's going to suffer." Maya studied him closely, trying to gauge the sincerity in his words. There was something in his eyes, desperation, guilt, maybe even a sliver of decency. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. Was he genuinely trying to help, or was this some kind of setup? But time was running out, and she couldn't afford to second-guess herself. If Reed was telling the truth, staying would only make things worse. If Blake came back and found her still in custody, she didn't want to imagine what he might do. Taking a leap of faith, Maya nodded and stepped through the door. "All right," she whispered, "let's go." Reed's face softened in relief, and he motioned for her to follow him. The cool night air hit her skin, sharp and refreshing, after the suffocating confines of the cell. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows as they navigated the perimeter of the station. Reed kept glancing at his watch, his anxiety palpable. "We don't have much time," he murmured. Maya didn't reply. Her mind was racing, caught between disbelief and urgency. She was free, at least for now, but the fight was far from over. This was only the beginning. The crisp night air hit Maya Ellis's face as she and Officer Reed moved silently through the dark back alley behind the precinct. For the first time in hours, she felt a small glimmer of hope. Every sense was heightened, every rustle of the wind, every faint footstep sent her heart racing. Maya was trained for high-stakes situations like this, but it was unnerving when the threat came from those sworn to uphold the law. Reed led her to a battered car parked at the end of the alley. He fumbled with his keys, his movements shaky, before unlocking the passenger door. "Get in," he whispered, his eyes darting nervously toward the precinct. Maya slipped into the seat, her eyes scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. Reed slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine with a low rumble that broke the night's stillness. The silence between them was thick with tension as they pulled away from the precinct. Maya's unease only grew with each passing second. They were out of immediate danger, but she knew Blake wouldn't let this slide. He thrived on control, and losing it would only make him more dangerous. Finally, Maya broke the silence. "Where are we going?" Reed kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Someplace safe," he said. "Somewhere Blake won't find you." Maya's skepticism flared. "And then what? I can't just run and hide. You know that." Reed glanced at her briefly, his face strained. "I know, but you need time. Time to figure out your next move, time to gather evidence against him. If you stay here, he'll bury you before you even get the chance." Maya leaned back, her thoughts racing. She hated the idea of running. It felt like admitting defeat, but Reed had a point. She needed something concrete to expose Blake's corruption. But where would she even begin? And after everything that had happened, who could she trust? The car sped through the quiet streets, the city lights blurring past them. Maya stared out the window, her mind working overtime. She needed to contact her team at the FBI, but Blake had confiscated her phone back at the station. Her fists clenched in frustration. "Reed," she said suddenly, her voice sharp, "we need to stop. I need a phone." Reed hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. "We can't stop. It's too risky." "I can't do this blind," Maya countered, her tone firm. "I need to contact my people if we're going to take Blake down. I can't work in the dark." Reed sighed, clearly torn. After a long pause, he relented. "There's a gas station a few miles up. We'll stop there, but it has to be quick. If Blake's already on to us, we're out of time." Maya nodded, her thoughts already racing ahead to who she would call. She knew exactly who could help. A trusted colleague who owed her a favor, someone she could count on to act fast and discreetly. When they reached the dimly lit gas station, Reed pulled into a secluded spot on the side of the lot. Maya scanned the area, her instincts on high alert. Every second mattered now, and she couldn't afford any mistakes. She stepped out of the car, her eyes darting around the lot as she made her way to the payphone. Reed stayed in the car, his head swiveling nervously as he kept watch. Maya quickly dialed a memorized number, her heart pounding as the phone rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered. "Ellis? Is that you?" Relief washed over her as Agent Carter's voice came through the line. "Yeah, it's me," she whispered urgently. "I'm in trouble, Carter. I need your help. Blake is dirty. He arrested me for no reason, and now he's trying to cover his tracks." There was a pause on the other end, and she could hear Carter taking a deep breath. "Okay, calm down. Where are you?" "I'm at a gas station just outside Brookhaven," Maya said quickly. "I escaped with the help of one of the officers, Reed, but I don't know how long we have before Blake realizes I'm gone. He's dangerous, Carter. We need to move fast." Carter's voice grew serious. "All right, listen, I'll pull some strings and send backup, but you need to stay low until we get there. Do you trust this Reed guy?" Maya glanced back at Reed, who was anxiously tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the dark parking lot. "I'm not sure," she admitted, "but he got me out of there, and right now, he's all I've got." Carter sighed heavily. "Okay, stay put. I'll do what I can, but be careful. Blake won't go down without a fight, and if he figures out you're working against him, things could get ugly fast." Maya nodded, though Carter couldn't see her. "Understood. Don't let me down, Carter." "You know I won't. Stay safe, Ellis." The line went dead, and Maya hung up, her mind spinning with everything she had to do. Backup was on its way, but she knew time wasn't on her side. She hurried back to the car, sliding into the passenger seat. Reed looked at her expectantly. "Everything okay?" he asked. "For now," Maya replied. "My team's sending backup, but we can't stay here. Blake will be looking for us, and it won't take him long to figure out I'm gone." Reed nodded, putting the car back into gear. As they pulled out of the lot and onto the road, Maya's determination solidified. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Maya Ellis hung up the phone, her mind buzzing with urgency and determination. She wasn't out of danger yet, but at least now she had a plan. Backup was on the way, and with Carter's help, she could finally bring Blake down. Hurrying back to the car, Maya slid into the passenger seat. Reed looked at her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Everything okay?" he asked. "For now," Maya replied, her voice steady. "I made the call. My team's sending backup, but we can't stay here. Blake will be looking for us, and it won't take him long to figure out I'm gone." Reed nodded, shifting the car into gear and pulling out of the gas station. As they merged back onto the road, the night seemed darker, the streets eerily empty. Maya kept a vigilant eye on the side mirrors, scanning for any signs of pursuit. So far, the coast seemed clear, but the tension in the car grew heavier with every passing moment. Her mind replayed the night's events, a chaotic blur of anger, confusion, and humiliation. She could still see Blake's smug sneer as he cuffed her, the sheer arrogance in his eyes. It made her blood boil. How could someone so corrupt hold such power? Maya glanced at Reed, who had been silent since they left the gas station. He looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn under the dim glow of the dashboard. Whatever had motivated him to help her, it was clear it had come at a cost. Whether it was loyalty to his colleagues or a sense of safety, she couldn't tell. "You didn't have to do this," Maya said softly, breaking the silence. Reed sighed, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Yeah, I did," he said, his voice low but firm. "I couldn't just stand by and let him get away with it. Blake's been corrupt for years, but no one's ever had the guts to stand up to him. He's got the whole precinct wrapped around his finger. I knew if I didn't do something, you'd end up paying for his mess." Maya studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why now?" she asked. "Why did you decide to help me?" Reed hesitated, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Because I've seen what happens to people who cross him. I've seen what he does to anyone who threatens his control. And you're not just another person he can push around. You're an FBI agent. If he took you down, it'd send a message to everyone else that no one's safe from him. I couldn't let that happen." Maya nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. Blake wasn't just trying to humiliate her. He was trying to make an example of her. He wanted to show that even someone with authority and power could be broken under his control. But Maya wasn't the type to be broken. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to let a corrupt, power-hungry officer like Blake strip her of that. No matter what it took, she would see this through. The silence between them returned as they drove. The city's outskirts gradually gave way to more rural surroundings. The roads grew narrower, the streetlights fewer and farther between. Reed had clearly chosen a route that kept them far from main roads, likely to avoid being tracked. After what felt like an eternity, Reed pulled into a secluded parking lot near the edge of a dense forest. The area was deserted except for a few scattered buildings in the distance. He turned off the engine and faced Maya, his expression grim. "We'll wait here until your team arrives," he said quietly. "It's out of the way and Blake won't think to look here, at least not right away." Maya nodded, though her instincts told her to stay on high alert. Every shadow seemed to stretch and move, and the eerie silence only amplified her unease. For now, this was their safest option, but she knew it wouldn't last long. Reed shifted in his seat, glancing nervously at the dark woods surrounding them. "We should stay quiet," he muttered. "If anyone's following us, we don't want to draw attention." Maya agreed, her gaze fixed on the dark expanse outside the car. They had come too far to risk being caught now. As they sat in the car, the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every rustle of leaves, every distant hum of traffic felt amplified in the oppressive stillness of the night. Maya's mind wandered to what her next move would be once Carter's team arrived. She couldn't just run and hide forever. She had to take action to ensure Blake was held accountable for everything he had done. But to do that, she needed a solid plan, and she needed proof. Maya Ellis sat in the dark, secluded parking lot alongside Reed. The faint glow of the dashboard cast shadows on their tense faces as they sat in silence, each passing minute heavier than the last. The stillness outside was broken only by the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. Maya's mind was racing. She needed more than just backup. She needed proof. Something concrete that could expose Blake for the corrupt officer he was. Reed kept glancing nervously at the rear-view mirror, his eyes darting to the side windows as though expecting someone to appear at any moment. Maya noticed his unease, but she didn't blame him. They were both running from a man who wielded power like a weapon, someone who would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. "I'm still trying to process all of this," Reed muttered, finally breaking the silence. "Blake's always been a snake, but I didn't think he'd go this far." Maya turned to him, her voice steady but firm. "He's more than just a snake. Blake thrives on intimidation and controlling everyone around him. But his time's running out, and I'm going to make sure of that." Reed gave a small nod, but still seemed doubtful. "I get that you want to take him down, but he's got the whole department wrapped around his finger. Most of them are too scared to say anything. They've seen what happens to people who cross him." Maya sighed. She understood that fear. She had seen it firsthand, the way Blake threw his weight around like he was untouchable. But this wasn't just about fear, it was about justice. Blake had gone too far, and now he was targeting her to cover his tracks. She wouldn't let him get away with it. "We need solid evidence," Maya said, thinking aloud. "Something undeniable that proves he's been abusing his power, something they can't ignore or dismiss." Reed frowned, looking unsure. "That's easier said than done. Blake isn't sloppy, he covers his tracks, and no one in the precinct is going to help us. They're all afraid of what he'll do if they talk." Maya's mind raced. Reed was right. Taking down Blake wouldn't be easy. Most of the officers either supported him or were too scared to challenge him. But she knew that people like Blake always made mistakes. It was just a matter of finding the right thread to pull. "There's got to be something," she murmured, more to herself than to Reed. "A paper trail, a witness, anything." Reed didn't reply, his gaze fixed on the windshield. The tension in the car was thick, and for a moment they both lapsed into silence, lost in their thoughts. Suddenly Maya's phone buzzed. Her heart raced as she fumbled for it, the screen lighting up with a message from Carter. The message was brief, but gave her the news she was waiting for. "Backup is 15 minutes away. Stay put." Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. Blake was relentless, and she knew this wasn't over. Backup was coming, but she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate. "Backup's on the way," Maya said, her voice steady but urgent. "We just have to lay low until they get here." Reed nodded, though he still looked uneasy. "I hope they get here before Blake does," he muttered. Maya didn't respond. She knew Reed was right to be worried. Blake wouldn't let her escape without a fight. To him, she wasn't just a nuisance. She was a threat, and he wouldn't rest until she was silenced for good. The quiet night was suddenly interrupted by the faint sound of an engine in the distance. Reed's eyes widened, and he quickly glanced at the side mirror. "You hear that?" he whispered. Maya tensed, listening carefully. The sound was growing louder, and her stomach churned with anxiety. Was it backup, or had Blake found them already? Reed leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. "I don't like this," he muttered. "We're too exposed out here." Maya's pulse quickened as she strained to see through the gloom. The distant rumble of the engine grew louder, and her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. If Blake had caught up to them, there was no telling what he might do. "We need to move," Reed said urgently, turning the key in the ignition. The car's engine roared to life, and Maya's heart pounded in her chest. They couldn't afford to sit and wait to find out who was coming. Reed slammed his foot on the gas, and the car lurched forward, tearing out of the parking lot and onto the narrow road. Maya glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of pursuit. Her hands clenched into fists, and she silently prayed that Carter's team would arrive soon. As they sped down the deserted road, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. Blake was closing in, and time was running out. Mitchell swerved onto a side road, the car bumping along the uneven pavement. They were deep in the rural outskirts now, surrounded by thick woods and silence. Maya's eyes darted between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. She scanned for danger. her voice finally breaking the tense silence. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked, her tone edged with doubt. "We're heading into the middle of nowhere," Maya Ellis said, her voice tight with anxiety as the car bounced along the uneven road. Reed shook his head, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "It's better than waiting around for Blake to find us. Out here, at least we have a chance." Maya wasn't convinced, but she knew they didn't have many options. They needed to buy time until Carter's team arrived, and staying on the move was the only way to avoid being cornered by Blake. As they drove deeper into the forest, the narrow road grew even more treacherous. The car jolted over potholes and cracks, and Maya clung to the door to steady herself. Suddenly, the sound of another car engine roared through the quiet night, and Maya's heart leaped into her throat. She turned to Reed, her eyes wide with alarm. "He's found us," she whispered. Reed's face went pale. Without a word, he pressed harder on the gas, the car accelerating as they raced down the winding road. Maya's pulse pounded in her ears as the headlights of a vehicle appeared in the distance, growing closer with every passing second. "Hold on," Reed muttered, his voice tense with fear. He swerved the car onto an even narrower road, barely wide enough for one vehicle. The headlights behind them closed in, and Maya knew they were running out of options. The car swerved violently as they sped down the treacherous path, Maya clutching her seat as she prayed they could outrun whoever was chasing them. Reed's grip on the wheel tightened as the road twisted and turned through the dense forest. The headlights from the vehicle behind them cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows that flickered across the trees. "Whoever that is, they're not giving up," Reed muttered under his breath, his voice edged with panic. Maya glanced at the side mirror, her pulse quickening as the car behind them crept closer. The glaring headlights seemed to pierce through the night, bearing down on them like a predator closing in on its prey. "It's Blake," Maya said through gritted teeth, her eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. "He's relentless, but we can't let him catch us. Not now." Reed nodded grimly, pushing the car harder. The engine groaned in protest as they tore through the winding road, the tires squealing as they rounded sharp curves. The forest loomed closer on either side, and the road seemed to narrow with every mile. "We're going to lose him," Reed said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. Maya wasn't so sure. Blake had already proven he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, and what he wanted was her. She could feel the weight of his obsession pressing down on her like a suffocating cloud. Ahead, the road suddenly split into two paths. Reed made a split-second decision, veering sharply to the left. The car lurched sideways, and Maya grabbed the dashboard to steady herself. The headlights behind them flickered for a moment before reappearing on the same path. "Damn it," Reed cursed under his breath. "He's still on us." Maya's mind raced. They couldn't outrun Blake forever, especially not on these back roads. They needed a plan, and fast. "We can't just keep driving," Maya said, her voice tight with urgency. "He'll catch us eventually. We need to do something." Reed glanced at her, his jaw clenched. "What do you suggest? We're out in the middle of nowhere." Maya's eyes flicked to the forest on either side of the road. The trees were thick and dark, their branches twisting together like a web. It wasn't an ideal hiding spot, but it was their only option. "Pull over," she said suddenly. "We'll ditch the car and head into the woods." Reed shot her a skeptical look. "Into the woods? Are you serious?" Maya nodded, her heart pounding. "It's our best shot. Blake won't be able to follow us through the trees. We can lose him." Reed hesitated, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror as the car behind them inched closer. Finally, with a deep breath, he nodded. "All right, let's do it." Reed swerved the car to the side of the road, skidding to a stop just as the pursuing vehicle's headlights loomed large behind them. Maya didn't waste a second. She flung open the passenger door and jumped out, her feet hitting the gravel with a crunch. Reed was right behind her, slamming his door shut as they sprinted toward the thick line of trees. The forest was dark and unwelcoming, but Maya didn't care. They needed to disappear, and fast. Behind them, the sound of the other car screeching to a halt echoed through the night. Maya's pace quickened. They didn't have much time. "We don't have much time," Maya Ellis whispered urgently, grabbing Reed's arm and pulling him into the shadows of the forest. The thick canopy overhead swallowed the faint moonlight, plunging them into near-total darkness. The uneven ground and dense underbrush made it difficult to move quickly, but Maya didn't dare slow down. In the distance, the sound of a car door slamming was followed by the unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel. Blake was coming. Reed stumbled behind her, his breathing labored. Maya could sense his panic, but they couldn't afford to stop now. "We need to keep moving," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "If he finds us." She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what Blake was capable of, and neither of them wanted to experience it firsthand. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Maya's stomach twisted in fear. Blake was too close, far too close. "Over here," Reed rasped, his voice hoarse as he grabbed her arm and pointed to a thick cluster of bushes ahead. Without hesitation, Maya ducked behind the bushes, pulling Reed along with her. The sharp branches scratched her skin, but she barely noticed. Her entire focus was on the approaching footsteps, each one sending a wave of dread through her body. They crouched in silence, barely daring to breathe as the footsteps drew nearer. Maya's heart pounded, and she silently prayed that the darkness would be enough to conceal them. The footsteps stopped suddenly, just a few feet away. Maya froze, her breath caught in her throat. She could hear the soft rustle of leaves under boots, the only sound in the still night. Her mind raced. What if Blake knew exactly where they were? What if he was just waiting for the right moment to strike? Beside her, Reed was trembling. Maya silently willed him to stay quiet, knowing that even the slightest noise could give them away. For what felt like an eternity, they remained frozen, tension thick in the air. Then, without warning, the footsteps started again, this time moving away. Maya let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. "He's going the other way," Reed whispered, his voice barely audible. Maya nodded, but her body stayed tense. Blake might have moved on for now, but she knew he wouldn't give up that easily. They were far from safe. "We can't stay here," Maya whispered, scanning the darkness around them. "We need to keep moving." Reed hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Carefully they stood and began making their way deeper into the woods. Their footsteps were nearly silent on the soft forest floor, but the night seemed endless, the weight of Blake's pursuit hanging over them like a storm cloud. Maya knew they couldn't run forever, but for now, staying one step ahead was all they could do. The deeper they went, the darker and more oppressive the forest became. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Even though they had managed to evade Blake for the moment, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, lurking in the shadows and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The uneven ground, littered with fallen branches and tangled underbrush, made every step a challenge. Maya's legs ached, but she forced herself to keep moving. They were still being hunted. Reed stumbled beside her, his face pale in the faint light filtering through the canopy. His breathing was heavy, and Maya slowed her pace slightly, glancing at him with concern. "You okay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the still night. Reed nodded, though his expression was grim. "Yeah, I'm fine, just trying to catch my breath." Maya could see the exhaustion in his face, but they couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while Blake was still out there, searching for them. "We have to keep moving," she said softly, her eyes scanning the darkness. "We need to find somewhere to hide until we can figure out what to do next." Reed didn't argue. He simply nodded and trudged on, though his steps were slower and more labored. Suddenly, Reed stopped in his tracks, his hand shooting out to grab Maya's arm. She turned to him, her heart leaping into her throat. "What is it?" she whispered urgently. Reed didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed ahead, his eyes wide with alarm. Maya squinted into the darkness, straining to see what he was looking at. At first, there was nothing but shadows. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she spotted something through the trees. A structure. Maya Ellis followed Reed's gaze, squinting into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing but shadowy outlines. Then, as her eyes adjusted to the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, she noticed the silhouette of a building in the distance. It was an old cabin, its weathered wooden frame barely visible among the dense forest. The windows were dark, and the sagging roof suggested years of neglect. It looked abandoned, but it was shelter, temporary at least. Right now, that was all they needed. "Come on," Maya whispered, tugging Reed's arm. "Let's check it out." They moved cautiously toward the cabin, their footsteps muffled by the forest floor. Maya couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. The cabin looked deserted, but she knew better than to let her guard down. Blake was still out there, and the last thing they needed was to stumble into a trap. When they reached the front door, Maya carefully tried the handle. It creaked loudly as it swung open, the sound echoing through the still night. She winced, but quickly pushed the door wider, motioning for Reed to follow her inside. The interior of the cabin was just as rundown as its exterior. Dust coated every surface, cobwebs hung thick in the corners, and the musty air smelled of decay. The sparse furniture, a few broken chairs and a table, looked ready to collapse. The warped floorboards creaked under their weight as they stepped inside. Maya closed the door behind them, scanning the room for anything useful. There wasn't much, but at least the cabin's walls provided some semblance of protection. "We can stay here for a bit," Maya said, though her tone betrayed her uncertainty. "Just until we figure out our next move." Reed nodded and sank into one of the broken chairs with a sigh of relief. He wiped his forehead, his face slick with sweat despite the cool night air. "This place gives me the creeps," Reed muttered, glancing around the dimly lit room. "But I guess it's better than being out there." Maya agreed, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The cabin was too quiet, too still. Her instincts told her to remain on high alert, but she didn't want to alarm Reed. "We'll be fine," Maya said, trying to sound confident. "We just need to rest for a bit, then we'll figure out what to do next." Reed nodded again, though his expression remained uneasy. Maya couldn't blame him. Everything about this situation felt wrong, and no matter what they did, it seemed like they were always one step behind Blake. Maya moved toward one of the windows, carefully pulling back a tattered curtain to peer outside. The forest stretched endlessly before her, dark and foreboding. She couldn't see any sign of Blake, but that didn't mean he wasn't out there. "We'll have to leave soon," she said quietly, more to herself than to Reed. "We can't stay here for long." Reed looked up at her, his expression weary but resolute. "What's the plan? We can't just keep running forever." Maya let the curtain fall back into place, exhaling deeply. "I don't know yet, but we can't go back to the road. Blake will be waiting for us." Silence fell between them as they each wrestled with their thoughts. Maya's mind raced, trying to come up with a solution, but nothing felt right. Every option seemed dangerous, and the thought of confronting Blake again made her stomach churn. The quiet was suddenly shattered by the sharp snap of a twig outside. Maya's heart leaped into her throat as she exchanged a panicked glance with Reed. "Did you hear that?" Reed whispered, his voice barely audible. Maya nodded, her body tensing as she strained to listen. There was no mistaking it. The deliberate crunch of footsteps echoed through the trees outside the cabin. Blake was here. Maya pressed her back against the cabin wall, her chest tightening as the footsteps grew louder. Each step sent a jolt of fear through her. She motioned for Reed to stay quiet, pressing a finger to her lips. His wide eyes reflected his fear, but he nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide. It was as though they knew exactly where Maya and Reed were and were taking their time getting to them. Maya's hand instinctively went to her waistband, where her FBI-issued firearm rested. In the chaos of their escape, she had almost forgotten it was there. She didn't want to use it. Violence was always a last resort, but if it came down to protecting herself and Reed, she wouldn't hesitate. The sound of the footsteps stopped just outside the cabin door. Maya held her breath, her heart pounding in her ears as the silence stretched on. She could feel Reed trembling beside her and silently prayed he would stay calm. Her mind raced, every worst-case scenario flashing through her thoughts. Blake was a man who thrived on power and control. He wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. The silence outside was deafening. Maya Ellis held her breath, her body tense as the sound of footsteps stopped just outside the cabin door. She gripped her firearm tightly, every instinct screaming at her to run. But there was nowhere to go. They were trapped. A few agonizing moments of silence passed before the door suddenly banged open, crashing against the wall with such force that the entire cabin seemed to shake. Maya's heart skipped a beat as she and Reed pressed themselves against the wall, desperate to stay out of sight. Heavy boots stepped inside, slow and deliberate. Her pulse quickened with every step, her body frozen as adrenaline coursed through her veins. Reed's face was pale with fear and his voice barely rose above a whisper. "Maya? What do we do?" She shook her head, placing a finger to her lips. "Stay quiet," she mouthed, her hand tightening around her gun. The figure in the doorway stood still for a moment, scanning the room. Maya could hear his shallow breaths, and her mind instantly recognized the pattern. It was Blake. She had heard his voice, seen his face too many times to mistake him for anyone else. But why was he moving so slowly? Was he toying with them, savoring their fear? Come out, wherever you are," Blake called, his voice dripping with cruelty. "You can't hide forever, Agent Ellis." Maya felt a chill run down her spine. He knew she was there. There was no point in hiding any longer. Slowly, she edged toward the corner, her back pressed against the wall, her gun drawn, but hidden by her side. She needed to stay calm, to stay smart. Reed's breathing grew heavier, and Maya placed a reassuring hand on his arm, willing him to hold it together. They couldn't let fear control them now. Blake took another step inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the dusty air. "You thought you could run from me?" he sneered. "You thought you could get away after everything you've done?" Maya's mind raced. What was he talking about? She had only been doing her job, investigating corruption and following the evidence. Yet here she was, being hunted like a criminal. "I know you're in here, Maya," Blake continued, his voice growing louder. "I can smell your fear. Why don't you make this easy on yourself and come out? You know this isn't going to end well for you." Her grip on her gun tightened. The weight of it in her hand grounded her, gave her a small sense of control in a situation spiraling into chaos, but she knew she had to tread carefully. One wrong move, and things could escalate beyond repair. Maya risked a glance around the corner, just enough to catch a glimpse of Blake. He stood in the center of the room, his flashlight illuminating the dust-filled air. His expression was cold and calculating, devoid of any humanity. This wasn't just a hunt for him. It was a game. He was relishing the power he held over her in this vulnerable moment. Suddenly, Reed shifted beside her. His foot brushed against a loose floorboard, the faint sound enough to shatter the silence. Blake's head snapped toward the noise, his body tense. "What was that?" he barked, his flashlight jerking toward their hiding spot. Maya's heart sank. They had been discovered. There was no more time to hide, no more time to plan. Taking a deep breath, Maya stepped out from behind the wall, her gun concealed at her side. "Blake," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her. "It's over. You need to stop this." For a brief moment, surprise flickered across Blake's face, but it quickly darkened, his expression twisting into a menacing glare. "Maya Ellis," he growled, his voice low and venomous. "I knew you'd show yourself eventually." Maya raised her free hand, trying to keep things calm. "This doesn't have to go any further. Let's just talk." "Talk?" Blake scoffed, taking a step closer. "You think I'm interested in talking after everything you've done?" Maya frowned, confusion clouding her thoughts. "What are you talking about, Blake? What have I done?" Blake sneered, his grip tightening on the baton in his hand. "You think you can just come into my town, start poking around in things that don't concern you, and walk away? You've crossed a line." It all clicked for Maya. This wasn't just about her investigation or a routine stop. Blake had something to hide, something her work had gotten too close to uncovering. "I was doing my job," Maya said firmly. "You can't keep running from this, Blake. Sooner or later, the truth will come out." Blake's face twisted with rage. For a moment, Maya thought he might attack her, but then he drew a deep breath, his expression hardening into icy resolve. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Agent Ellis," he said quietly, "but you will, soon enough." Before she could respond, Blake lunged at Maya, his baton raised high. Acting on instinct, Maya ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow. She spun around, her gun fully drawn, but before she could aim, Blake grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully until the weapon fell from her hand with a clatter. "Reed!" Maya shouted as Blake shoved her to the floor. Reed yelled in alarm, rushing forward to help, but Blake was faster. With a swift motion, he shoved Reed aside and turned back toward Maya, his face filled with deadly intent. Maya lay on the floor, dazed and momentarily weak from the impact. The flickering light of the cabin cast eerie shadows on the walls as she fought to regain her composure. Reed stood nearby, his hands raised in a futile gesture of defense as Blake loomed over him. Maya's mind raced. Blake had stripped her of her gun, but she still had her training and quick thinking. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. With a sudden burst of energy, she rolled away from Blake, creating distance between them. Her heart pounded as she scrambled to her feet, scanning the room for anything she could use as a weapon. Blake, momentarily surprised by her resilience, growled in frustration. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" he sneered. "But this ends now." Maya spotted a heavy metal pipe lying in the corner of the cabin. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She dashed toward it, grabbing it just as Blake lunged at her again. With a swift swing, Maya struck him, sending him stumbling back. The impact bought her a few precious seconds to think. Blake staggered but quickly recovered, his face twisted with rage. "You think a pipe is going to stop me?" he snarled. "You've got another thing coming." Despite his bravado, Maya noticed a flicker of hesitation in his movements. He wasn't as confident as he seemed. "Reed, stay back," Maya shouted, her voice commanding. "Find help." Reed hesitated, torn between staying and running, but the determination in Maya's eyes was enough to push him into action. He nodded and bolted for the door, disappearing into the night. Maya's attention snapped back to Blake. He was recovering from the blow, his fury growing with each passing second. She realized she could use his anger against him. If she made him underestimate her, it might give her the opening she needed. Blake advanced again, and Maya shifted into a defensive stance, swinging the pipe deliberately to keep him at bay. "Why are you doing this, Blake?" Maya demanded, her voice firm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "What's your endgame?" "You think you're so high and mighty, don't you?" Blake snarled, venom dripping from his words. "You FBI agents think you can come into my town, dig into things that don't concern you, and walk away." Maya could see the hatred burning in his eyes. This wasn't just about her. Blake was protecting something, and her investigation had hit a nerve. But there was no time for answers now. Blake lunged again, but this time Maya was ready. She sidestepped his attack and swung the pipe once more, landing a solid hit on his arm. Blake roared in pain, clutching his injured arm as he staggered back. Maya seized the opportunity. With a well-aimed strike, she knocked the baton from his hand, sending it skidding across the floor. She moved to retrieve it, but Blake wasn't finished. Desperation flashed in his eyes as he lunged at her one last time. Just as he reached her, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Maya's heart leaped with hope as the sound grew louder. Help was finally on the way. Blake's expression shifted from rage to panic as he realized his time was running out. "You're finished, Blake," Maya said, her voice resolute. "The police are coming." Blake hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door. For a moment, it looked like he might try to flee. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice low and threatening. "You haven't heard the last of me." Before Maya could respond, Blake turned and fled through the back door of the cabin, vanishing into the darkness. Maya wasted no time. She grabbed the fallen baton and rushed to check that Reed had made it to safety. Moments later, flashing lights illuminated the cabin as the first police vehicles arrived. Officers poured in, their faces a mix of urgency and concern. "Agent Ellis?" one of them called out. "Are you okay?" Maya nodded, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. "I'm fine." But Blake's armed and dangerous. He fled out the back. The officers immediately sprang into action, spreading out to search for Blake. As the chaos unfolded, Maya felt a wave of relief. The immediate danger had passed, but she knew the fight wasn't over. Blake was still out there, and her mission was far from complete. She took a deep breath, allowing herself a brief moment to regroup. Justice would prevail, no matter how long it took. The sirens grew louder, and Maya Ellis spotted flashing lights cutting through the darkness outside the cabin's windows. Relief washed over her as the first police cars screeched to a halt. Their headlights pierced the night, casting long shadows across the trees. Officers poured into the cabin, their faces a mix of concern and determination. "Agent Ellis?" one officer called out, his voice filled with recognition. "Are you okay?" Maya nodded, her body trembling from exhaustion but still holding steady. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice firm. "But Blake is armed and dangerous. He fled out the back. We need to find him." The officers wasted no time, quickly forming teams and spreading out to search the surrounding forest. Their movements were precise and coordinated, their voices carrying commands into the night. Maya watched them go, her mind racing. Blake wouldn't get far, not with the police now fully engaged and equipped to track him down. With her detailed description of his appearance and the events that had unfolded, they stood a strong chance of capturing him. As the officers disappeared into the trees, Maya's thoughts turned to Reed. He had made it out safely, but she knew this night would leave scars on them both. It wasn't just the physical danger. It was the betrayal, the corruption, and the sheer weight of everything they'd faced together. The cabin, once a place of fear and vulnerability, now felt like a refuge. It was a temporary sanctuary in the midst of chaos. Maya leaned against the wall, exhaling deeply. She was grateful for the backup and support, but she also knew the fight wasn't over. Blake was still out there, and the case she had been working on remained unresolved. For now, however, Maya allowed herself a moment to breathe. The immediate threat had passed, but the journey for justice was far from complete. As the night settled back into an uneasy stillness, Maya's resolve strengthened. She would ensure that Blake was held accountable and that the truth she sought would come to light, no matter how long it took. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for part 2. We'd also love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Let's strengthen our community together.